critics of the Bush administration, the story of what George Bush did and didn't do during his Vietnam-era National Guard service isn't going away just yet. It's a sharp contrast to 2000, when media didn't seem to much care. Some of the most comprehensive reporting this time round is being done by Salon.com senior editor Eric Boehlert. We'll talk with him about that story. But first, as usual, we'll take a look back at recent press.
The media were buzzing when George W. Bush agreed to sit down with NBC's Tim Russert for an hour-long Meet the Press interview on February 8th. Some wondered if the hardened newsman Russert wouldn't eat George W. Bush alive. But when the interview hit the airwaves Sunday morning, it wasn't Russert's tough questioning of Bush that was remarkable. Quite the contrary, as Russert allowed Bush to evade some questions and failed to follow up on some of Bush's obvious distortions. When Russert asked Bush if he'd release all the records of his National Guard service, Bush's response was curious. Quote, "Yes, absolutely. We did so in 2000, by the way." Close quote. Of course, anyone following that story knows that Bush did not release all the available records 4 years ago. They haven't even done so now. But Russert let it slide. In explaining the federal deficit, Bush claimed, quote, "The budget I just proposed to Congress cuts the deficit in half in 5 years," close quote. But straightforward reporting had already revealed the release of 5-year projections, rather than usual 10-year, as something of a ruse. As the New York Times explained 5 days before the Meet the Press interview, quote, "In offering a plan to cut the federal deficit in half by 2009, President Bush ignored more than $1.5 trillion in tax cuts and spending commitments that come due shortly afterward," close quote. The Times also noted that Bush's budget numbers exclude, quote, "most of the cost of the Medicare prescription bill and all of the costs of keeping American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan beyond this year," close quote. But Russert failed to follow up on this pretty obvious distortion. So why didn't Russert live up to his reputation as a Sunday morning pit bull? Well, maybe that reputation is somewhat exaggerated to begin with. As the London-based Financial Times put it on February 6th, Russert is, quote, "an interviewer who, by America's standards of deferential on-air treatment of politicians, is known for his combative style, awkward questions, and persistent follow-ups," close quote. In other words, it's all relative.
There's a lot of discussion in the press right now about George Bush's credibility, from his claims about pre-war intelligence on Iraq to his accounting of his service in the National Guard. Usually, once media get hold of a theme like that, they look for more things to fit it. So it's kind of interesting that the press has so far failed to make much of another story that would fit right in with the "how credible is Bush" motif. It seems the White House had to backpedal recently on a claim that Bush made in his 2002 State of the Union address. Bush said then that diagrams of American nuclear power plants were among, quote, "our discoveries in Afghanistan that confirmed our worst fears," close quote. Actually, there were no such diagrams found, as the White House acknowledged after the group Greenpeace released a letter from an official at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission casting doubt on the claim. Apparently, the administration came up with the assertion based on various of their intelligence sources. Sounds familiar? As a White House spokesman told the Wall Street Journal, which did a February 11th report on the revelation, beyond those intelligence sources, quote, "there's no additional basis for the language in the speech that we have found," close quote. Sounds like a story to us, but as Columbia Journalism Review pointed out in an item on their campaign coverage blog, apart from that Wall Street Journal piece, big media aren't exactly running with it. The New York Times tucked the revelation at the bottom of page A22, and even then could only make themselves say that Bush, quote, "was probably wrong," close quote, when he said that blueprints for U.S. nuclear power plants had been found in Afghanistan. And that was better than the Washington Post, which has yet to report the story in their paper edition. They seem to feel that the most it merits is a link to the Journal and Times story in an online-only White House briefing book.
In a February 3rd column about elections at Pacifica Radio's Washington, D.C. station, WPFW, Washington Post columnist Mark Fisher warned that a group of extremists is trying to hijack the station. Fisher wrote, quote, "An election this week will determine whether a generation of young people in this region will grow up hearing America's most important musical heritage or a steady diet of political propaganda." close quote. Fisher describes a battle raging between a group he says is trying to protect the station's tradition of jazz programming and a group that he claims is trying to remove jazz from the station and replace it with, quote, political whining and grousing of the most one-sided and ill-informed sort, close quote. Attempting to support his argument, Fisher writes, quote, at question is whether WPFW will remain true to the mission it assigned itself when it signed on in 1977, close quote. Fisher then cites part of the station's mission statement, quote, jazz, a major American art form which grows from the African-American experience, will be the major music program, close quote. But he omits the part that begins, quote, WPFW is dedicated to programming which reflects progressive social change and democracy, close quote. In researching candidates for the WPFW elections, which ended February 5th, we were not able to find any candidate calling for the banishing of jazz from the station. We wonder why Fisher neglected to name even one of the supposed schemers. In the end, it's Fisher's column that sounds sort of like ill-informed political whining and grousing. We should note that WPFW carries this show.
Thank you, Steve. You are listening to Counterspin. Counterspin is brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group Fair. The Houston Chronicle joked that with his 2005 federal budget, George W. Bush has made good on his promise to bring bipartisanship to Washington, because both parties have problems with the $2.4 trillion package. Reporters have aired a range of criticisms of the administration's proposals from a number of perspectives, but media watchers know that economics coverage is dominated by spin. Everything depends on which numbers you emphasize and which you ignore. So the general public often doesn't really know how a budget will fall out till it starts, well, falling out. Here to help us dissect the coverage we are getting is Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and author of the weekly Economic Reporting Review, which appears on that group's website, cepr.net. Welcome back to Counterspin, Dean Baker.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we even talk about what's in the new federal budget, I know you have some thoughts about the terms in which journalists tend to present budget information. What do you think the problem is there?
Well, one of the things, I mention this regularly in the Economic Reporting Review, but one of the things that I really don't think anyone can even argue with them is that, when you refer to a particular budget item, let's say TANF, the Reformed Welfare Program, the appropriation will be somewhere around $20 billion. I won't swear to that last number there, but when you tell someone this is $20 billion, 99% of the people, even if you take it well-educated people with college degrees, advanced degrees, they couldn't tell you is that a lot of money or a little money. It's more money than any of us will ever see in our lifetime. But the fact is that would be true if you added a zero or took away a zero. So the result of that is they have very little sense of, is this $20 billion that we're spending on TANF important in terms of the whole federal budget? And what I've often argued is, instead of giving a number that is basically meaningless to the overwhelming majority of the people who hear it, you can simply express it as a percentage of the federal budget. That $20 billion is roughly 1% of the federal budget. And if reporters got in the habit of saying, well, they're appropriating 1% of the federal budget for TANF, approximately 25% of the federal budget for defense, then budget reporting would be informative. It would be telling people something. They would have a clear idea of where their money's going, where the taxes are coming from. Taxes can be expressed as a percent of the budget. These would be meaningful numbers. But as it is, most people have no idea what this number is.
Well, reporters seem to pick things by the interest factor of the item rather than its relative proportion in the budget. So we've seen whole stories on what ABC News called the big increase in funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, for example.
That's right, and this is one of these things that, it can become an emotional issue. Obviously you have a lot of right-wingers that like to yell about this as a horrible thing because, the money's going to obscene art or anti-religious art, whatever they complain about. And there is obviously a constituency for National Endowment for the Arts. There are people who support themselves that way. People who care about what's being supported. They don't think it's a good program. But in terms of the budget as a whole, that particular item would be about 1/100 of 1%. So, if you want to have an argument, maybe we shouldn't be spending more money in the art, maybe we should. But the point is, it will make zero difference. If you think here are your tax dollars, you won't even notice. We can make it zero, we can double it. It's such a trivial item in the budget. It makes no difference in terms of the deficit or what people are paying in taxes.
So what are some of the elements in this new budget package that you think might perhaps be beneath mainstream media's radar? What are some of the factors?
Well, one of the biggest that I think really deserves attention, both because it's big, but also because, it's important public priorities, is what's going on with the military budget over the last, 3 or 4 years. In the Clinton administration, the military budget was roughly 3% of GDP. At that time, about $300 billion. Currently, we're looking at military budgets that are over 4% of GDP. And then if you add in the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're now, the Bush administration treats as supplemental separate items. But if you add those in, we're up around 5% of GDP. This is quite a big boost in spending, and it's received almost no attention. I mean, obviously the war has, but, again, the implication is even if we're to get our troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan tomorrow, we'd still be spending over 4% of GDP on defense, on the military. And again, just to give someone a comparison, that increase of more than 1 percentage point in GDP, from 3 to 4%, that's larger than the projected shortfall in Social Security over the next 75 years. So we have a lot of people running around saying we should be really worried about Social Security, but without even any public debate, we've increased defense spending by a larger amount over the span of 3 years.
Well, several accounts that I've read have indicated that military spending is going to increase, and non-military discretionary spending, I've read, will be held to an increase of 1% or less. But you think there's something missing even from that, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, two parts of I'll just keep it simple. When you say an increase of 1% or less, I think it's not talking about 0.5%, but, whatever, this is in stone. But the point is that we expect spending in general to increase both because of inflation, which is running somewhere in the order of 2.5% a year. I mean, that's what's being projected. That's not my number. That's, the government projections on that. Plus, we expect spending to increase more or less in step with economic growth, that if we have, a larger economy, people get pay raises, we have more students in schools, so it takes more money to educate them. So basically, to just maintain service levels, the Congressional Budget Office calculates this, so it's not a mystery. To maintain service levels at their current level, you have to have increases of approximately 3%, give or take a few tenths. So when you talk about spending increases of 0.5% or 1% a year for discretionary spending, you're talking about, in effect, cuts, and that may not be that big a deal over 1 year, let's say perhaps a 2% cut. But if you project that out 5 years, as actually President Bush does in his budget, you're talking about cuts that are close to 10%. That's a big hit.
And there's certainly just a plain old difference between a small increase and an actual de facto cut. A lot of press attention has focused on the deficit, which I always find a pretty murky subject. It seems to require interpretation in a deeper context than it's usually given. But we all remember media during Clinton talking about how you can balance your checkbook at home. It's an outrage that the federal budget isn't balanced. Now we hear that Dick Cheney reportedly said that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter. What should we make of this $520 billion deficit? And do you think the focus on it is misdirected or not?
Well, the focus, I think, has confused people more than enlightened them. I mean, there are differing views among economists, but I think there is to some extent a consensus on certain items. And one of those is that when you have an economic downturn, when you have a weak economy, as we do today, having a large deficit is not a problem. It's in general a good thing because you need that to stimulate the economy. Not to say that having tax cuts to rich people is the best way to do it. It was about the worst possible way to do it. But nonetheless, the deficit in and of itself in 2003, 2004, that's not a problem. But what is a problem, and again, I think you'd get a fair degree of consensus. There'll be a little difference on magnitude here, but you get a fair degree of consensus that you can't run large deficits indefinitely. You could run small deficits. Small in this context, again, the relevant number isn't, 100 billion, 200 billion. Those are real big numbers to all of us. But we have to ask relative to the size of the economy. And here, if we want to make the comparison to a household, it's a really big deal if I owe $1 million. It's not a big deal if Bill Gates owes $1 million. What matters there is, how rich are they? And for the country, what we have to ask is how big is the deficit relative to the size of the economy? If it's 1 or 2% of GDP, we could basically do that forever. But currently we're looking at deficits that are close to 5% of GDP. That's not a problem in 2004 when we have a weak economy. That will be a problem if we're still doing that in 2007, 2008, 2009. We hope the economy's recovered.
Well, finally, and we've just got about a minute, you alluded to this, but somewhere inside them, if not in the lead, many reports on the budget make matter-of-fact reference to what the New York Times on February 10th described as the crisis in Social Security. The Chicago Tribune on the 8th referred to the future explosive costs of the program as the real problem here. What should folks know about that angle?
Well, they should know it's not true, and I just encourage people, look directly at the Social Security Trustees Report yourself. It's up on their website. The program is financed by a separate tax. It's fully solvent for 40 years with no changes whatsoever. Their numbers, not my numbers. And, no one disputes that. And what we have here is a little trick that's, it has potentially horrible implications, because what they would like to do, a lot of people, Greenspan, in fact, testified to this today, they would like to not repay debt that is owed to Social Security, in effect default on the government debt. And, it would really be an outrage if the public let them do that, because we paid the taxes on that. So to then turn around and say, no, that was just a joke, we're not going to repay the bonds that Social Security holds, that's basically theft, and it'd be the largest theft in the history of the world, and I just really hope the public doesn't allow that to happen.
We've been speaking with Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. You can read his economic reporting review on the group's website. It's www.cepr.net. Thank you, Dean Baker.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
The controversy over George Bush's extended absence from National Guard duty when he claimed to be serving with units in Texas and Alabama in the early 70s only seems to be growing. The media's newfound interest in the story serves to underline how little attention journalists paid to this story during the 2000 campaign. Some of the most comprehensive reporting we've seen on the AWOL story has been by Salon.com's senior editor Eric Bollick. His two articles from February 5th and 11th pull together the facts of the story and also take a look at the news coverage since the 2000 campaign. Eric Bollick joins us now by telephone. Welcome back to Counterspin, Eric Bollick.
Thanks for having me.
Eric, let's begin with the story itself. Give us a thumbnail sketch of the questions hanging over George Bush's Guard service record.
Sure. He joined the Second National Guard in 1968 and spent 2 years training to become a pilot, fighter pilot. And he was a pilot from 1970 till 1972, and everyone agrees his excellent ratings and no questions about his service. But then in the spring of 72, he left Texas to work on a campaign in Alabama, and he did several things. He failed to take a physical in the summer of 72. He never flew again after the spring of 72, even though the government had spent about $1 million in 1970 to train him to become a pilot. He essentially sort of walked away from his flying career. So he goes to Alabama to work on this campaign, and he was supposed to be doing guard duty, 1 week a month, a couple weeks in the summer. But there was no evidence that he had showed up in Alabama, and there was also questions about, after the election in 72, he returned to Texas. He was supposed to have ended his career through January to the fall of 73, but there are also questions as to whether he ever showed up in Texas, mostly because his discharge papers, there was no evidence of him showing up, particularly between May of 72 and May of 73. His commanders couldn't remember his whereabouts, and no one could locate any of his guardsmen colleagues who said they trained with him during that year. So that was the story in 2000. It's pretty much still the story today. And so the question was, did he essentially walk away from, his National Guard duties for a year or more?
Well, in your February 5th Salon report, you wonder if the media will give this story the attention it deserves this time around. Can you talk a little bit about the media's body record on this story going back to the 2000 campaign?
Yeah, it was first reported in the Boston Globe, May 23rd. Walter Robinson did a pretty extensive piece, ran on page 1 and laid out all the details I talked about. Did lots of reporting with Bush's commanders and things like that. And there it sat, and it got a brief life in literally the last week of the campaign when some Democratic senators returned to it, people like Senator Hidaway and Kerry, Bob Kerry, and they wanted to make the point that, Al Gore had served in Vietnam, but where was George Bush? It's amazing how little attention it got, because so much of the 2000 campaign coverage was sort of, the character issue, and there was, endless detailing about Al Gore and, his sort of personal foibles and whether he exaggerated, and whether he was a phony, and if he said a girl had to stand in her Sarasota classroom because it was too crowded, as he said during the first debate. Well, they scurried down the floor to find out she wasn't still standing because, the school crowding wasn't that bad. So the next day we had headlines about Al Gore being an exaggerator because he sort of slipped on the tongue. And here's George Bush, legitimate questions. Questions at the time that the Bush campaign didn't really even challenge. They never said the Boston Globe got it all wrong, showing that he didn't show up for duty for a year. Got almost no airplay. I mean, the story broke in May of 2000. The New York Times didn't even mention it in its news pages for 2 months. I think they made 3 mentions in the whole campaign. And, they weren't really alone. It was just a collective turn to the head, really. I mean, the Boston Globe put the story out there, and everyone looked at it and kept walking. And it showed no interest. And it's literally the exact same story that is now, safe to say, has sort of consumed the press for the last 5 days.
Well, we mentioned the New York Times. It's played a special role in this story. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, like I said, the Globe piece came out on May 23rd of 2000. In July 11th, the Times ran a big front-page story about a sort of biographical piece about Al Gore's time in Vietnam. Then they also ran a sidebar, a 1,000-word story about George Bush's time in the Texas National Guard. And incredibly, even though the Globe had raised very serious questions about Bush's National Guard record, the Times does a story about Bush's National Guard time and never mentions that there are these questions. 2 weeks later, they came back with a 3,000-word story, sort of biographical, Bush post-Yale, his time in Houston in the early 70s. They devoted about 300 words to, any questions about his service in the National Guard. And then when the story came up right on the eve of the election, the Times did a piece, a 500-word piece, essentially trying to undercut the Boston Globe story, saying, the Bush campaign actually had documents to prove that Bush showed up, and maybe these doubts were overblown. And so the Times sort of, in a way, by ignoring it throughout the summer and then coming to the Bush's defense on the eve of the election, I think they sent a signal to the rest of the press corps saying that this story is not really, worth attention, and that it's not really legitimate. And again, it's literally the exact same story, which every news organization is now detailing this week.
This story is making headlines every day. To what do you attribute the media's new interest? What sparked this new inquisitive energy?
Well, it had such a strange beginning because initially it began during the Democratic debate in January when Peter Jennings challenged retired General Wesley Clark to divorce himself from comments that Michael Moore, the documentary, had made at a Clark rally, saying that Bush was a deserter. And Clark said, well, I haven't really looked into it. He has his own right to say what he wants to say. And then some of the Republicans and some of the pundits took Clark to task, saying, it was outrageous to call Bush a deserter. But then Democrats decided, especially with sort of the collapse of the Dean campaign and the rise of the Kerry campaign, that they might like to look at Bush's record during the Vietnam War if their leading contender was a Vietnam War hero. So the Democrats started pushing the issue, and so then the press got interested. To be fair, in 2000, the Gore campaign never really made an issue out of this until the closing week. So now the Democrats have decided they want to make an issue, and the DNC chief Terry McAuliffe was out front on the issue. But also, I think Bush has been caught in a down cycle in terms of his press coverage. His poll numbers are down, which I think usually sparks more interest from the press. And they've bungled it pretty badly. The classic case is not releasing documents to answer the questions. Then when they did release the payroll and the retirement summary point documents on Tuesday, it was sort of a colossal failure. It was probably the worst press briefing Scott McClellan has ever had. He was just, bombarded with questions for at least half an hour from reporters who looked at these documents, and they said, this is supposed to prove your case. Half of them were unreadable. the other half never proved that he showed up in Alabama. So they haven't done a very good job with the document dump. They continue to refuse to release all Bush's military records, as he said on Meet the Press on Sunday that he would. So the interest is that there's still lingering questions that the White House will not release enough documents to answer the question.
Eric Bullard, how do you see the future of this story? Will it die down or will it keep raging?
Well, it depends. I think it's probably going to die down. I mean, it got very hot this week, and it'll just depend on what the White House releases in terms of documents, and if they are able to, really address any of the resolving questions.
We've been speaking with Eric Bullard. You can read his work on Bush's National Guard service at salon.com. Thanks for joining us, Eric Bullard.
Sure thing. Thanks a lot.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR, based in New York. FAIR also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. And be sure and tell them you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. To hear Counterspin on the web or to find out more about FAIR, you can check out our website. It's www.fair.org. The show is engineered by Alex Noyes at Mercer Media. With me is Steve Rendell. I'm Janine Jackson. Thanks for listening to Counterspin. Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Janine Jackson, here with Steve Rendell. This week on Counterspin, declaring that, thanks largely to his tax cuts, the economy is strong and getting stronger, and prosperity will soon reach every corner of America, George W. Bush proposed his 2005 budget last week. But is media coverage clarifying the potential impact of the $2.4 trillion package, or just making a confusing issue more confusing? We'll hear from Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Also on the show, despite the best hopes of the Bush administration, the story of what George Bush did and didn't do during his Vietnam-era National Guard service isn't going away just yet. That's a sharp contrast to 2000, when media didn't seem to much care. Some of the most comprehensive reporting this time round.
Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, the conflict in Haiti, which some say could result in a coup against the democratically elected government, is an emerging story. But many reports point to President Jean-Bertrand Aristide's faults as the cause of the crisis, while often failing to mention key facts, including U.S. support for Haitian opposition groups and for economic restrictions on Haiti. We'll talk to Mark Aristide of the Haiti Support Network. Mark Aristide is no relation to the Haitian president. Also on Counterspin today, taking the FCC to court. Public interest lawyers were in a Philadelphia appeals court this month to challenge the FCC's decision last year to relax some media ownership restrictions. So what's at stake, and what could the outcome mean? We'll speak to one of the attorneys, Angela Campbell of Georgetown University's Institute for Public Representation. All that's coming up, but first we'll take a look back at the week's press.
Some of the recent media coverage of the election has focused on whether the Democratic nominee needs to win southern states to take the White House. This got renewed attention late last month when frontrunner John Kerry said that, quote, everybody makes the mistake of looking south, close quote, in response to a question about appealing to Southern voters. Over the press corps, that put Kerry's campaign in sharp contrast with Southerners like then-contender Wesley Clark and John Edwards. Kerry's comments were considered a minor gaffe, but was he wrong to suggest that he didn't necessarily need Southern states? Newsweek magazine certainly thinks so. Their February 16th issue reports that Kerry's opponents don't think he'll sell in the South, where, quote, if history is any guide, Kerry, or any Democrat, would need to win at least 5 states to gain the presidency, close quote. But if Newsweek really wanted to use history as a guide, all they'd need to do is flip the page in their own magazine and look at the electoral map they published. It shows that Al Gore won no Southern states in the South in 2000, but a victory in any number of non-Southern states, like New Hampshire, for example, would have ensured his victory. Conventional wisdom is often mistaken, but it's a little unusual for an outlet to get it right and wrong in the same edition.
White House Chief Economic Advisor Greg Mankiw caused a minor storm this month when he explained that outsourcing, the movement of U.S. jobs overseas, quote, is a growing phenomenon, but it's something that we should realize is probably a plus for the economy in the long run, close quote. The comments were criticized by many Democrats and even some Republicans. Some media outlets were a bit slower to react, but their responses were interesting. Take the New York Times. Though it's often derided as a liberal paper by the right, this incident was a reminder that the Times knows where it stands on economic issues. The Times Week in Review section on February 15th featured 2 articles taking Mankiw's side. An op-ed headlined, Why Your Job Isn't Moving to Bangalore, could be found just a few pages from another piece headlined, The Bright Side of Sending Jobs Overseas. And if you didn't get that message, 2 days later the Times editorialized that, quote, there's something about George Bush's economic team that seems to compel its members to say true things at inconvenient moments, close quote. The Times took aim at the Democratic shameless pandering, explaining that, quote, someone should point out that Mr. Mankiw was right. Call center jobs in India do lift that country's standard of living while freeing up American capital, labor, and other resources for more efficient, high-value uses, close quote. The paper is certainly free to take that position, but how about giving readers another view on the matter? Remember this the next time someone starts talking about the liberal New York Times.
Conservative activists have started a campaign to amend the U.S. Constitution to ban gay marriage. Some political reporters see this as an important issue in the presidential election, so clear reporting on the matter is essential. But that's not often what you get from the mainstream press. The key here is what the proposed amendment would mean for same-sex civil unions. Some conservatives claim that it would allow states to permit civil unions, a message you hear loud and clear from the media. ABC reporter Terry Moran, for example, said the amendment, quote, would define marriage as a union between a man and a woman, but allow states to establish civil unions for gay couples, close quote. The New York Times agreed, reporting that, quote, the proposed amendment would allow state legislatures to recognize gay civil unions, a provision that had alienated many conservatives, close quote. So we know what conservative activists are saying, but are they right about what the law would do? Not necessarily. There is no clear language in the amendment that would allow civil unions. In fact, some legal experts have argued that it is so vague that courts could interpret it as actually banning civil unions. But few media outlets are pointing this out. The Washington Post was an exception, running a piece that explained that 2 of the amendment's authors believe its first sentence would probably ban gay unions. If this does become a serious campaign issue, let's hope the media starts setting the record straight on what the amendment might actually mean.
When Washington Post reporter Dana Milbank appeared on NPR's Fresh Air on February 17th, a recent internet rumor about a prominent politician's private life was discussed. When host Terry Gross asked Milbank about how his paper decided whether to cover such a story, Milbank explained how rumors typically cycle through the rumor mill, often beginning on the internet, then showing up in British tabloids before making it into U.S. tabloids and finally ending up in mainstream U.S. media. Milbank explained the Washington Post's criteria for covering such a story. Quote, if there's accuracy to the rumor, then of course we're going to be covering it. If there's no accuracy to the rumor, most likely we'll do it as we did this week. and that is have our media writer write about everybody else writing about it, close quote. In other words, Milbank was saying, accurate or inaccurate, one way or another, the story will be in the Washington Post. There was no discussion of the traditional journalistic wisdom that the private lives of public people are not journalistically relevant, except in extraordinary circumstances. The rumor in question, which originated on the Drudge Report, has since washed out. That's nothing new. Several such Drudge exclusives have washed out in the past, including the false rumors that Clinton White House aide Sidney Blumenthal abused his wife and that Bill Clinton fathered a child with a black prostitute. But accuracy is no barrier to getting a story into the Post, as Milbank seems to say, and many other outlets agree, as this last rumor was discussed everywhere from the New York Times to ABC World News Tonight to Fox News. Yes, even Fox News.
And finally, on several occasions, we've pointed out problems with the New York Times reporter Judith Miller's stories on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. Over the years, she repeatedly relied on Iraqi defectors of dubious credibility for dramatic weapons exposés that helped support the White House's case for war. Most notably, Miller broke a major story last May about an Iraqi scientist who allegedly revealed hard evidence of a chemical weapons program. Her story, which was quickly debunked, was fed to her and vetted by the U.S. military, which wouldn't even let her interview the scientist in question. In the February 26 New York Review of Books, writer Michael Massing criticizes Miller for dismissing the serious doubts many in the intelligence community had about Iraqi weapons. In response to his charges, Miller revealed a rather striking philosophy on investigative reporting. Quote, "My job isn't to assess the government's information and be an independent intelligence analyst myself. My job is to tell readers of the New York Times what the government thought about Iraq's arsenal." Close quote. Funny, we thought that was White House Press Secretary Scott McClellan's job. A journalist's job is to be an independent and critical investigator, not a mouthpiece for the administration.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. FAIR also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll be giving extra subscription information later on in the show. Reports on the growing conflict in Haiti typically portray it as one between Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his supporters, who are often described as thuggish, and various opposition groups. Reporters often give the opposition groups nuanced treatment, pointing out that some are armed and militant, others insist they are nonviolent, though all call for the ouster of the democratically elected president. But time and again, U.S. reporting leaves out crucial facts and context. For instance, U.S. media outlets often report that irregularities in Haiti's 2000 election are a key opposition grievance. Seldom mentioned is that when international observers raised questions about 7 Senate seats out of 7,500 total offices filled nationwide, the senators in question stepped down and Aristide offered new elections. But the opposition refuses to participate or even negotiate. Joining us now to talk about coverage of Haiti is Marx Aristide. He's no relation to the Haitian president. Marx Aristide is a board member of the Haiti Support Project. Welcome to Counterspin, Marx Aristide.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Marx, the story in Haiti is very complicated, so we can't possibly get to everything. But there have been many stories criticizing President Aristide, suggesting that his governance is the main reason for the current crisis. ABC World News Tonight and the New York Times, for instance, ran stories on February 17th doing this, with ABC quoting the U.S. ambassador to Haiti, placing the blame on Aristide. What's missing in that kind of reporting?
Well, I think the opposition to Aristide had never wanted Aristide to assume the presidency to begin with. Even before the votes were held, they had mounted a serious campaign against his party. And also what's missing is the financial and logistical backing that sectors in Washington are giving to the opposition. Organizations such as the International Republican Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy, which are both propping up the opposition as a counterweight to Aristide.
As well as USAID, from what I hear.
Yes, that's correct. So it's not just a question of Aristide's governance, although there are issues to be made with that, but it's the opposition that is getting financial backing from U.S. sources, and as a counterweight to Aristide, because they judged that he was too popular and they want to promote what they call a multi-party system in Haiti.
Tell us a little more about the opposition.
Sure, the opposition is composed of various elements, but the main element is the economic elite, which for a long time never invested any of its wealth to the development of Haiti. One guy that has gained a lot of prominence is Andre Appey. Andre Appey is the owner of sweatshops in Haiti. And there are organizations, labor rights organizations in Haiti, who describe the way he functions within these sweatshops as horrific, because he does not respect workers' rights. He does not even respect paying them the minimum wage. And this is the guy that has been going around Haiti presenting himself as a champion of democracy, human rights, and respect for workers. So the future does not really bode well for the development of Haitian workers if indeed Andy Appey is the one who's going to help charter this new future.
In addition to the Haitian opposition receiving money from such U.S. organizations as the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and the International Republican Institute, the U.S. is also helping to keep economic sanctions or restrictions on Haiti, aren't they?
Yeah, well, that's part of the thing. One of the reasons that Aristide has lost part of his popularity is because he has not been able to deliver on the promises he made to the people when he took office. And the reason for that, at least a big chunk of that reason, is because he has not received any aid whatsoever from the United States or even from the European Union. And the U.S. has used its influence in such organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank to block loans that were agreed to for Haiti. So Aristide has been making do with almost nothing. And so because he has not been able to respond to the population's cry for more education, more roads, more food, people have grown increasingly discontent with his governance.
Now, in addition to the U.S. supporting opposition groups and suppressing loans to Haiti, you also have the Bush administration utterances on Haiti. They're very curious. They seem to be sort of all over the place. Tell us what you make of say, the comments coming out of the State Department over the last couple of months.
Well, on the one hand, they acknowledge that Aristide was legitimately elected in 2000, and so they cannot overtly say they want him to step down. On the other hand, there's no doubt that there is no love lost between the Bush administration and Aristide, and they're doing everything they can to undermine him by suppressing the loans, by propping up the opposition, and by floating such ideas as recently as last week that they could envision a solution to the Haitian crisis that does not involve President Aristide staying until the end of his term. And so we see these contradictions playing on a daily basis, and from one day to the next, you're not sure exactly what to believe coming out of the administration. But one thing is constant, is the continued support to the opposition, which emboldens them and makes them think that they don't really have to negotiate in good faith with Aristide to find a solution to the crisis.
Marx Aristide, I'm looking at some reports. Even Amy Willants, who has written with sensitivity on Haiti in the past, published an article in the February 15th New York Times faulting Aristide and making no mention of the U.S. role in the conflict. Are you seeing any good reporting? Are you seeing reporting that mentions sort of the whole complex situation there?
Frankly, it's hard to see, except for an article that was published in Z Magazine. I think the fellow's name is Tom Reeves. And his article more or less tried to capture the entire essence of the situation in Haiti. But by and large, we get bits and pieces of things, and they really do not tell the whole truth about what's happening.
Marx, where pro-democracy groups and human rights groups agree about several things in Haiti, including there should be more reporting on the U.S. support for the opposition and the U.S. suppression of loans to Haiti, there's a lot of disagreement about Aristide. Some people are more defenders of his and others more detractors. Give us your own take on Aristide.
Well, Aristide was universally accepted in 1994, and his legitimacy was not questioned by anyone, really. today is a different story. There has been legitimate issues of human rights violations raised. There have been issues of his governance and how he has managed the administration of justice. And for that reason, there are a lot of progressive organizations in Haiti, as well as groups in the Solidarity movement, who have criticized Aristide for his handling of the situation in Haiti. I think Aristide has committed a lot of errors. Chief among them is his belief that he could work with paramilitary organizations in Haiti to deal with his opponents. There are lots of reports about Aristide's former allies, paramilitary organizations in Gonaïves, who have now turned against them. And these are people that he relied on in the past to do his bidding in places like Gonaïves, which are now in rebel hands.
Aristide has agreed to new elections, but the opposition has refused to participate in elections or talks. Though this is seldom raised in reporting, doesn't this intransigence give the opposition a kind of veto over the lifting of economic restrictions, as the U.S. refuses to ease restrictions unless there are new elections?
Absolutely. No, it's really a catch-22 for Aristide, because the condition that they have put on Aristide is, look, you need to organize new elections, you need to provide a secure environment for the opposition to function, you have to undertake all these steps, many of which call for the opposition to play ball. For example, the opposition is supposed to send its own representative to the Electoral Council that has the responsibility to organize the elections. They have refused to do that, and unless they do, Aristide cannot proceed with an electoral council and hold new elections, because certainly those elections would not be recognized as legitimate by the international community. And so they have maintained this veto power, and I think it's on the basis of the support that they're getting from outside of Haiti that they've been so intransigent and not willing to negotiate in good faith.
We've been speaking with Mark Aristide. He's a board member of the Haiti Support Network and no relation to the Haitian president. Thanks for joining us, Mark Aristide.
It's a pleasure.
Last year, the FCC was flooded with public comments about their proposal to weaken some of the rules that prevent media companies from getting even bigger. Despite the fact that the public voiced overwhelming opposition to the FCC's plan, the commissioners voted 3-2 last June to loosen several very important rules about ownership. But now a legal challenge to the FCC decision is underway. Public interest lawyers were in court on February 11th to argue that relaxing the rules is a bad idea. With us to discuss the case is one of those lawyers, Angela Campbell. She's the director of Georgetown University's Institute for Public Representation. Angela, welcome to Counterspin.
Thank you.
Now, in the interest of full disclosure, we should note that FAIR, the group that produces Counterspin, is a petitioner in this very case. Now, as I understand it, you were on one side in court arguing that there are some major flaws in the FCC's deregulation plan, and lawyers from some media companies were on the other side saying the FCC didn't go far enough. Explain the argument you're making to the court a couple days ago.
Okay, well, I was appearing on behalf of a whole range of public interest groups: Prometheus Radio, Media Alliance, the National Council of Churches, Consumers Union, as well as FAIR and a few other groups. And we were basically arguing that the FCC had gone way too far in terms of deregulating, that they had not supported their decisions with actual evidence in the record. They were basically making the claim that you didn't need these rules anymore because there were so many sources of news and public affairs available to the public. And our counter-argument was, when you look at what sources are actually available in local communities, it's still primarily television stations and newspapers, and that therefore those should not be allowed to be commonly owned, because that would reduce the number of editorial voices at the local community level.
Now, you mentioned TV and newspapers. The FCC's relaxation of the cross-ownership rule would allow a TV station and a newspaper to be owned by the same company in the same town. The FCC came up with something called a diversity index to show that fewer owners wouldn't necessarily affect the diversity of content. Where is the FCC going wrong with that, do you think?
Well, the FCC actually came up with a rule, a major change. The rule had been simply that if you owned a newspaper, a daily newspaper, you could not also own a television station or a radio station in the same community. That rule has now been replaced by a rule that says if there are 3 TV stations in the community, then a newspaper and a television station or radio station can become a news. And the diversity index was the method that the Commission used to arrive at this magic number 3. And a lot of our case had to do with why we thought the diversity index just simply didn't make any sense at all. And therefore, there was no factual basis for the Commission's rule, which was the number 3.
Now, I understand in the diversity index, one example people were pointing out was the fact that a community television station received a higher priority in their index than the New York Times. Explain that case.
That's right. I mean, the index was intended to evaluate how many diverse sources of local news were available in the community so that the Commission could identify at-risk communities. But the problem was that instead of analyzing what sources people actually did provide news and what sources people actually used for news, the Commission counted every single television station, even if it didn't provide any news, even if it was a home shop. They counted all the radio stations, even if they didn't have any news. They counted the internet and so forth, so that when you worked out the numbers in a particular market in New York, for example, they weighted the small community station as being more important or having a greater share than the New York Times. And the court picked up on that at the oral argument, asked the FCC about it very specifically, and the FCC admitted that was actually a mistake, that they shouldn't have included that station in their analysis. But they didn't change the overall analysis, which we felt was with the way they had done it. They didn't admit that the way they had done it was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand, it's hard to read how the arguments are going, but the oral arguments went much longer than would have been anticipated. Tell us about the situation inside the court that day.
That's right. The court had initially said that our side would get 45 minutes, that the industry groups that were opposing the FCC rule, that thought the rule should be eliminated altogether, would get 45 minutes, and then the FCC would have 90 minutes to defend against both sets of petitioners. But what actually happened was the court had many, many questions for everyone, and they didn't cut anyone off, and so the argument started at 9:30 in the morning and went till almost 6 o'clock at night.
Well, Broadcasting and Cable magazine recently suggested that the outcome of the case is hard to predict. Las Vegas wouldn't take this bet, was how their reporter put it. We won't ask you to place any bets, but what are some of the possible outcomes from this case? What could conceivably come from this?
Well, statistically, the most likely outcome in any appeal of an administrative agency order is that the court affirms what the agency did. Here it is hard to tell because the judges asked questions of every side and did not really tip, I would say, which way they were going. Although even if they had, you can't necessarily know that that's what they're really thinking. They may just be testing you. So I think it's possible that the court could decide that the commission, at least some aspects of the commission's decision, were not adequately supported by the record or were irrational and remand on that basis. They could also find that the legal standards applied by the commission were not the right legal standards, and they could remand for further work in the commission to make sure that they actually applied the correct legal standards.
So it could be a rewriting of the rules altogether in some cases?
It could be.
Yeah. Now, where can people look to keep up on this case as it moves along?
Well, the next thing that will happen in this particular case is that the court will issue a decision, and that could be, they indicated it would be soon, but, it could be a month, 2 months, 3 months. It's hard to tell. The thing I would emphasize is that this case is not going to resolve the issue, because even if we win in this case, and I hope we do, and it gets sent back to the commission, that just means the commission has another chance to to re-adopt the rules and to try to support them better than they had before, or to come up with different rules that may be somewhat more in the public interest but still not necessarily be protective enough of the public's interest here. So I think the other areas where this issue is being debated will continue to be important. That is Congress and the FCC itself.
We've been speaking with Angela Campbell. She's the director of Georgetown University's Institute for Public Representation. If you want to keep up on this case, you can check out two websites, www.mediaaccess.org and www.mediareform.net. Angela Campbell, thanks for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR, based in New York. FAIR also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following toll-free number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. Be sure to tell them you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. You can also hear Counterspin on FAIR's website at www.fair.org. This show is engineered by Alex Noyes at Mercer Media and co-hosted by Peter Hart and myself, Steve Rendell. Thanks for listening to Counterspin. Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, we'll be joined by investigative journalist Robert Dreyfuss, who will talk to us about faulty pre-war intelligence on Iraq and how a secret and largely unaccountable organization inside the Pentagon manufactured and publicized much of the dubious intelligence at the core of the Bush administration's case for war. He wrote about all of this in a recent Mother Jones article, The Lie Factory. Also on Counterspin today, we'll take another look at the crisis in Haiti. It's now a top story in the media, but our news report's giving us enough background about what led to the current standoff. We'll ask Mary Turk, editor of Connection to the Americas, a publication from the Research Center. All that's coming up, but first we'll take a look back at the week's press.
On February 24th, George W. Bush announced that he would support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would ban gay marriage. The discussion in the media was often a tactical one, which parts of Bush's base this would appeal to, and so on. But some TV pundits took things a bit further than the facts would seem to allow. On the February 24th broadcast of the Fox News Special Report with Brit Hume, Fortune magazine's Jeff Birnbaum explained that Bush was advocating a consensus position, a comment that drew approval from NPR's Mara Liasson, who's often considered the liberal on that Fox show. Asked to explain himself, Birnbaum added, quote, the polls indicate that people are strongly in favor of marriage between a man and a woman, close quote. If Birnbaum is saying that most Americans are opposed to gay marriage, some polls suggest he may be right. But Bush was advocating for a constitutional amendment, of course, and that's not the consensus position. A survey from the University of Pennsylvania, for example, has 48% opposing an amendment, compared with 41% in support. A Time CNN poll earlier this month had the numbers a little closer, but nothing that would suggest a consensus. The point the Fox pundits were making was that Bush was just responding to the will of the people. There's little evidence to back that up.
Most economists credit Bush's tax cut in rebound, was the headline from the February 17th USA Today report. You'd think the story following such a loaded headline would support its claim. That is, you might expect that USA Today had actually canvassed enough economists to show that most credited Bush with the economic rebound, which raises another of the headline's assumptions, that the economy can be categorically said to be in rebound. But USA Today reporter Perenada Payne quotes exactly one economist, Ed McKelvey of the investment firm Goldman Sachs, who says the Bush tax cuts were one contributing factor in the recent higher economic growth rate. However, McKelvey also warns that the cut's long-term effects could hurt the economy by increasing deficits. The only other economist quoted on whether the tax cuts sparked a rebound is Harvard's Benjamin Friedman, who tells USA Today, quote, "There were so many things going on over the past few years. Disentangling them is extremely difficult, almost impossible," close quote. So the USA Today report tells us nothing about what most economists think. What we learn from the piece is that one economist says the tax cuts contributed to growth. Another says it's hard to tell. In other words, there was nothing in the report to justify the catchy and uplifting headline.
And finally, Bill Moyers has announced that he will be leaving his PBS show Now in November. The show has been targeted by conservatives for being too liberal, and it still seems very likely that Republican lawmakers intend to make Moyers an issue when they discuss reauthorizing government funding for public broadcasting. In any event, Moyers' departure gave some right-wingers reason to smile. Fox News Channel Bill O'Reilly was happy with the news, pointing out on his February 20th broadcast that, quote, "Our pal Bill Moyers is quitting his show over at PBS. Few people watch it," close quote. The day before, the Associated Press noted that Moyers' program gets about 2.6 million viewers. The wildly popular O'Reilly Factor, though, gets about, 2.5 million viewers, and that's on a good night. In fact, according to Television Week, Nielsen ratings at the end of 2003 show O'Reilly averaging fewer than 2 million viewers a night. Not that anyone's counting.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. FAIR also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll be giving subscription information about Extra later on in the show.
In the past week, the situation in Haiti seems to be deteriorating, with armed forces hostile to President Jean-Bertrand Aristide claiming they will soon attack the capital in an attempt to remove Aristide from office. But with all the recent media attention paid to Haiti, some important context is missing from the story. Joining us now to talk about some of what the news accounts don't adequately explain is Mary Turk. She's the editor of Connection to the Americas, a publication of the Resource Center of the Americas. You can find them at www.americas.org. Mary Turk, welcome to Counterspin.
Thank you.
Now, the media tend to offer a kind of a thumbnail of recent history in Haiti, and the piece you wrote tries to set the record straight. Let's take one example, the 2000 elections in Haiti and the aftermath. On February 20th, the New York Times explained that many officials in the United States were ambivalent toward Aristide, and they summarized the case this way. They said that Aristide, quote, refused to hold new parliamentary elections after allegations of fraud in 2000, close quote. What's wrong with that summary of the history?
Oh, there are several problems with that summary. First of all, there is the question of allegations of fraud. 2000 parliamentary elections which had occurred were closely observed by the OAS and other international observers who found them not marred by fraud. The complaint that the opposition raised in regard to those 2000 parliamentary elections had to do with senators, 7 or 8 senators who were seated by the Electoral Council despite the fact that they had a plurality rather than a majority of votes. They had perhaps 40% rather than 50% plus 1 of the votes. The complaint was that there should have been runoff elections in those cases. Now, at the point of the parliamentary elections in May of 2000, Aristide had not yet been elected himself and was not yet in office. He was subsequently elected in, I believe, November of 2000 and took office in 2001. He did not refuse to hold new parliamentary elections. The only seats in question were those 7 or 8 seats. Eventually, over his term in office, he convinced those senators to resign, therefore opening the way to new parliamentary elections. But the opposition refused to participate. The opposition has consistently refused to participate in elections. They do not want new elections because they don't have majority support to win those elections.
Now, there's reporting on the opposition, and it can sometimes give the impression that the armed groups that we're hearing a lot about are somehow linked to the opponents of Aristide who are a party to this attempt to solve this somewhat peacefully. That's not necessarily the case, though, correct?
No, that's not the case at all. Even the political opposition is divided. The political opposition consists of a core of the business elites who have opposed Aristide forever. They have also been joined by some people who oppose Aristide because of the ineffectiveness and some corruption within his government over the past 4 years. That's the political core that has been negotiating, or that says it's been negotiating. Now, what happened in negotiations is Aristide has agreed to a number of proposals put forth by international mediators, including CARICOM, and most recently the United States as well. Aristide has agreed to each of those proposals. Each time the opposition has said, no, we refuse. So negotiation is difficult, not because Aristide is refusing, but because the opposition refuses to agree to any proposal except his leaving immediately. Now, that's the political opposition. They are not the same as the armed groups that have taken over Cap-Haïtien and Gonaïves during the last week. Those armed groups are led by former military officers and criminals who have in the past led military death squads during the time of the military dictatorship from 91 to 94. Many have been living in exile in the Dominican Republic in order to avoid being jailed for the murders that they've committed. They have, in some cases, been trained previously by the United States in Ecuador. Some of them have been in contact with U.S. either CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency operatives in the past. There's no solid proof of present connections other than the fact that they are well armed.
Now, one major area of concern to U.S. media should be what U.S. policymakers are saying about Haiti. You point out in your piece that officials from the Bush administration often contradict one another, or they offer very vague responses to inquiries from reporters about what the administration intends to do in Haiti. How do you think the press has done in evaluating the administration's response to the crisis in Haiti?
I think the press has been astoundingly uncritical of the Bush administration's contradictions. I have read on the same day statements by Secretary of State Colin Powell saying that we will not support the forcing from office of a democratically elected president, which Aristide clearly is, and statements by Richard Boucher saying, well, it's probable that the government will have to change and that will mean the consequence would be Aristide stepping down. There's no attempt that I have seen in the mainstream media to highlight these contradictions, but that's not unusual.
The mixed signals that are being sent, particularly those signals that the U.S. is not going to lend any real support to Aristide's government, are somewhat encouraging to the opposition, particularly the armed opposition, but also the opposition that is supposedly negotiating.
Well, the opposition that is, I hate to say the opposition that's negotiating, but the opposition that people are trying to negotiate with has always had substantial U.S. support. Members of the opposition for years, member groups for years, have had funding from the National Endowment for Democracy through the National Republican Institute.
International Republican Institute.
Right. They have had U.S. connections and U.S. support, even when the United States sent troops in 1994 to end the military government and reinstall Aristide as the elected president at that time. U.S. troops and U.S. officials reported that it was easier to deal with the opposition than with the Lavalas, the supporters of Aristide, because the opposition just understood how to talk to them better. They weren't poor and uneducated. So the opposition has always enjoyed substantial U.S. support.
Mary Turk, as you're watching this story unfold, what else frustrates you in the media coverage of Haiti, and are there any outlets you think are doing a better job than most?
Let me take the second part of that question first. I think that Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman's show, has done an absolutely outstanding job of coverage on the situation. They've given in-depth reports. They have had interviews with various people who are familiar with the situation, including Congresswoman Maxine Waters of the Black Congressional Caucus. They've done a very good job. Unfortunately, most of the mainstream media have done the kind of crisis response that means ignoring Haiti until blood is shed and then moving in to oversimplify the situation. I have been pleasantly surprised at the Miami Herald's frequent in-depth coverage. However, they have done a much better job than any of the other mainstream press.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Miami Herald because they sought to answer one of the basic questions, namely, how many people are in this armed opposition in the streets, you don't see very many media accounts try to answer that question. And the Herald came to the conclusion that there were no more than 250 armed rebels in this opposition movement right now. Finally, Mary Turk, what else concerns you about the coverage of Haiti right now?
The pattern has been to fault Aristide for every breakdown in negotiations, to say that negotiators are trying to get President Aristide to agree to a political solution. That completely ignores the reality that Aristide has repeatedly agreed to negotiators' proposals, and it's the opposition that has refused any negotiated success.
We've been speaking with Mary Turk. She's the editor of Connection to the Americas. That's a publication of the Resource Center of the Americas. You can find them on the web at www.americas.org. Mary Turk, thanks for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thank you.
Faulty intelligence led the U.S. to attack and occupy Iraq. That narrative is a dominant one in U.S. media reviews of the Iraq adventure. As a February 8 New York Times editorial put it, quote, "The risks of waging preventive war on the basis of faulty intelligence have become so starkly evident," close quote. In the media storyline, CIA professionals are often singled out as the source of the bum steer. This sort of mistakes were made narrative is one that largely lets the White House off the hook and ignores an increasing body of evidence suggesting that Bush administration officials concentrated in the Pentagon manufactured the case for war by touting disinformation, dubious intelligence, and questionable sources. All this while often ignoring conflicting information and caveats. Investigative journalist Robert Dreyfuss has been looking into the faulty intelligence story for some time. His piece, The Lie Factory, is co-written with Jason Best and appears in the latest edition of Mother Jones magazine. It can be read online at motherjones.com. Welcome back to Counterspin, Robert Dreyfuss.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Robert, when David Kaye announced that he didn't think they'd find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he was adamant that the administration was misled by the CIA and that intelligence was not shaped or distorted by the Bush administration. Much of the media discussion followed that same line, but your article suggests that there's a lot more to the story. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Well, I think the most important thing is that while the CIA probably did not get very much right about Iraq, they were at least convinced, most of the intelligence agencies, that there was a lot of doubt, that there were a lot of things they didn't know. The doubts got completely erased in the policymaking circles, and in particular, the Pentagon set up its own little sort of rump intelligence unit called the Office of Special Plans under Douglas Feist at the Pentagon bureaucracy. Not only was responsible for deleting these doubts, but they had some value added too. They added in their own spin and their own intelligence, part of which came from Iraqi exiles, part of which came from their own staff, which was doing its own intelligence. And they created talking papers that ended up wildly exaggerating the threat that Iraq allegedly posed to both the United States and to its neighbors. And that information went directly to Vice President Cheney's office and to the White House, and I think it led the administration in the direction of going to war, because that was a war they already wanted. In other words, the idea that they were invading Iraq based on faulty intelligence has it exactly backwards. They had already decided they wanted to invade Iraq. So the intelligence was then used to justify a pre-existing policy. And for Bush to argue, or anyone else to argue, that the administration went to war based on faulty intelligence is just plain silly. They would have gone to war in any case, but they were afraid to make the argument that Saddam Hussein is a bad guy, and therefore for reasons of national strategy, for reasons of oil, for reasons of Middle East policy and protecting Israel, for all these reasons, were going to invade Iraq. That probably wouldn't have sold either to the American public or to Congress. So instead, they picked on this Iraq as a threat argument.
So, Robert Dreyfuss, can I assume that the lie factor you referred to in the title of your piece refers to this internal Pentagon Office of Special Plans?
Yeah, it started right after 9/11. Within a month of 9/11, they set this unit up, and it wasn't called the Office of Special Plans then. It had a different name. It went from being something like 2 or 3 people, and it expanded and brought in contractors and consultants, and eventually took the name Office of Special Plans, which incorporated this intelligence unit. That's what became basically the War Planning Office at the Pentagon. Then after the war last summer, disbanded.
And from what you report, they pushed out analysts that weren't going along with the program to some degree.
They really purged anybody who wasn't part of the zealous team of missionaries that believed in the war. These people were forced into retirement and transferred to other offices. Some of them just quit in disgust. And they brought in people, ironically, who were not intelligence experts, people who were ideologues, but who were not particularly skilled at either intelligence collection or analysis. And so what they did is they took these piles and piles of information, thousands of little data bits, and they picked out the ones that supported the case for going to war, and they discarded all the rest. And any intelligence conclusion is based on evaluating all of the information, a lot of which is going to be contradictory. Some of it's based on forged documents, on lies, on misinformation, on just plain old honest human mistakes. So all of that information, isn't going to agree. And the job of an intelligence analyst or a professional is to look at it all and say, here's my conclusion, and here's the reasons why my conclusion isn't 100%. So I give this a certain, percent validity. Well, this office didn't do that at all. They just basically said, we're gung-ho for war, and Iraq is an enormous threat to American national security, and all of the junk that we heard about unmanned aerial vehicles striking the United States and Iraq building its nuclear program and importing, WMD-related materials, all of that was a crock.
In your reporting of this, Robert Dreyfuss, you conducted a lot of interviews, and one that was particularly compelling was one you did with a certain former Air Force colonel. Tell us about that story briefly.
Her name's Karen Kwiatkowski. She was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and she worked inside the Pentagon in the Near East, South Asia Affairs Office, which was where this Office of Special Plans took shape. And so she watched it all week by week, taking shape, and she was horrified by it. She's gotten some renown lately. She's written articles herself for magazines, and she's been interviewed by news media. She is a tremendously courageous whistleblower, in fact, because she's a conservative, not someone who's some sort of fuzzy-minded liberal. She was, however, shocked by what she called the neoconservative cabal that was shaping the way this office operated, and in particular by the intervention of people like Dick Cheney's staff director Louis Libby and others who were tasking or assigning, jobs and missions to this unit, which is highly unusual. It's an office that should work down deep in the bowels of the Pentagon, and here's the Vice President's office operating on a day-to-day basis in touch with them. So she saw all of this, and she decided to talk about it. I think she's one of the people that, if I were starting an investigation in the Senate of this, I would call her first and say, come and tell me what you know.
Robert Dreyfuss, at this point, it seems that some very good reporting has come out of mainstream media, particularly from the Washington Post. But some critics suggest that the Post hasn't pushed its reporting to the front page often enough. Even Washington Post Ombudsman Michael Gettler wrote recently, quote, "Make sure you read page A17 or wherever the next piece of the puzzle appears," close quote. What do you think of the priority the media has given to this story so far?
Well, I think it has gotten somewhat lost. I think for two reasons. One is it got lost because the aftermath of the war was so catastrophically bad. An insurgency and complete mess and seemingly completely bumbling administration, U.S. administration over there, that's become the main story. And then second, it was sort of obvious that Bush and Cheney were saying WMD for months and months and months. We got over there and they weren't there. So what else can you say except, well, we didn't find them and they were wrong. So I think they sort of lost the handle on how to investigate the wrongdoing. I think the core of the problem is the media is unwilling to look at the government and say that there's conscious malfeasance happening. They much prefer to say this was a mistake or this was just, incompetence or conflict of interest or all kinds of other things that are more, more easier to swallow than to say that someone was out there deliberately manufacturing evidence. One of the most obvious cases is no one has really investigated who forged those uranium documents. There's the thing. There's no argument that those documents were deliberately forged by someone. It wasn't a mistake. And finding out, what we know about who forged them, and I believe that somebody in the intelligence system here knows, is something that reporters ought to be just leaping into. And except I don't see that too many people are even asking the question. And there are other questions like that I think have just been ignored, and in part, because reporters follow the official investigations. And now there have been several efforts by the Republicans in Congress to intimidate investigations and say, well, there's nothing there. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee has pretty much said that point blank. And so I think to the extent that the official investigations are turning into cover-ups, then I think the media is finding it difficult to get these kind of more explosive charges onto the front page.
You've appeared on Counterspin before discussing Iraqi National Congress leader Ahmed Chalabi and his unreliability. A recent Knight Ridder story points out that, in spite of the fact that defectors and witnesses put forth by Chalabi's INC, quote, exaggerated what they knew, fabricated tales, or were coached by others what to say, close quote, the U.S. intends to continue funding the INC's intelligence gathering. The Knight Ridder story hasn't received much attention in other media now. What are your thoughts on this part of the story? Bear in mind that we only have a few seconds left, Robert.
Well, we're not just funding him, we're supporting him to become the next president of Iraq. Here's a guy who's a long-term historic crook and bank embezzler. Now we know he's also a liar about intelligence, and the Pentagon is still supporting him to become the leader of the nation, never mind a couple $1 million to fund his organization. So I continue to be stunned and amazed that Chalabi has any credibility whatsoever with anyone, although apparently he's been quite a valuable source for Judy Miller at the New York Times over the years, so I guess he's got some friends in the media himself.
We've been speaking with investigative journalist Robert Dreyfuss. His article, The Lie Factory, co-written with Jason Best, appears in the current issue of Mother Jones magazine. It can be read online at motherjones.com. And you can read Robert Dreyfuss's regular commentary at his blog at tompaine.com. His blog is titled The Dreyfuss Report. Thanks again for joining us, Robert Dreyfuss.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR, based in New York. FAIR also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following toll-free number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. Be sure to tell them you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. This show is engineered by Bill Siri at Mercer Media and co-hosted by Peter Hart and myself, Steve Rendell. Thanks for listening to Counterspin. Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, we'll be joined by investigative journalist Robert Dreyfuss, who will talk to us about faulty pre-war intelligence on Iraq and how a secret and largely unaccountable organization inside the Pentagon manufactured and publicized much of the dubious intelligence at the core of the Bush administration. Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, a British and American plan to spy on United Nations delegations in New York has been big news in Britain, opening up a debate over the diplomatic struggles leading up to the war with Iraq and the legality of the war itself. The U.S. media, though, has hardly batted an eye at the story. We'll talk to one of the lead reporters on this story, Martin Bright of the London-based Observer newspaper, about what they've been reporting and why he thinks the story has failed to attract attention here in America. Also on Counterspin today, when a veteran journalist challenged New York Times columnist William Safire on matters of accuracy, he found the newspaper wouldn't print his column and had no workable policy for correcting misinformation on its op-ed page. Former CBS 60 Minutes producer Barry Landau will tell us about his experience trying to keep the New York Times honest. All that's coming up, but first we'll take a look back at the week's press.
When Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide was whisked out of Haiti by a U.S. government plane on February 29th, the White House insisted that Aristide resigned and fled Haiti voluntarily. The next day, though, stories emerged contradicting this official line. Human rights activist Randall Robinson and Congresswoman Maxine Waters each reported that Aristide told them he'd been the victim of a coup and was taken away from Haiti under duress, when U.S. authorities told him they would not protect him and his family if he stayed. Whatever the truth, with such controversy swirling around this story, ABC's Nightline oddly chose to make Assistant Secretary of State Roger Noriega its lone guest on March 1st. Noriega, of course, dismissed contradictory accounts, but that wasn't the only strange thing about the Nightline episode. Since Noriega was the only guest on a controversial subject, Nightline had a responsibility to inform its viewers about his background. Viewers should have been clued into the fact that Noriega had been trying to undermine Aristide since his days working for the Organization of American States in the early 90s. In 1994, Noriega opposed returning the democratically elected Aristide to office after his removal by a military coup. And in 1997, Noriega went to work for the far-right U.S. Senator Jesse Helms, a man said to have shared Noriega's loathing of Aristide. Nightline anchor Chris Bury might have also questioned Noriega's commitment to democracy by citing Noriega's support for the coup d'etat against Venezuelan elected President Hugo Chavez in April 2002. Bury might also have questioned Noriega about official U.S. support to Haitian opposition groups and about reports that Haiti's armed opposition have been seen carrying state-of-the-art U.S. weapons. Instead, all Nightline offered viewers was the official story, one that had been available to them throughout the preceding day.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan caused a stir on February 25th when he apparently announced that Social Security was in financial trouble. One nightly newscast said that Greenspan warned that a financial catastrophe is looming, while another said that critics predict nothing short of a train wreck ahead. That's always been the media consensus. The real debate is when the train wreck will actually happen. According to CBS correspondent John Robert, that train wreck will happen just 4 years from now. As he explained on February 25th, quote, Alan Greenspan was looking ahead 4 years to the date the nation's 77 million baby boomers start to retire. That's when the Social Security surplus, which has been used to offset government spending, begins to dwindle and, in 2017, disappears altogether, close quote. But the Social Security surplus does not disappear in 2017. That is when estimates suggest the fund will start paying out more money in benefits than it collects in taxes. We'll actually still have a multi-trillion-dollar surplus at that time. A more relevant but less alarming report might note that according to the Social Security Trustees report, the fund is projected to pay all promised benefits through the year 2042 with no changes whatsoever. And for the record, Greenspan actually sounded less alarmist than the media reports. He expressed more concern for Medicare than for Social Security, cautioning that, quote, "The concern is not so much about Social Security, where benefits are tied in a mechanical fashion to retirees' wage histories, and we have some useful tools for forecasting future outlays," close quote. That's not quite the story you heard in the press, but they've been writing the collapse of Social Security stories for so many years, it's hard to get them to stop.
On March 1st, New York Times correspondent Elizabeth Buehmiller devoted her White House letter feature to George W. Bush's support for a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. Buehmiller says that Bush's critics are wrong if they think that this move is proof that he's either intolerant or playing politics. She writes, quote, "Although the president's behavior might reinforce the view among his critics that he was acting cynically when he endorsed the amendment, the fact is that he has a record of tolerance in personal situations," close quote. Buehmiller then described Bush's warm relations with an old friend who is gay. It doesn't matter what Bush thinks of gays or lesbians in private. And if Bush is, in fact, comfortable with gays and lesbians, does his decision to back the amendment conflict with his personal views? Couldn't that actually be considered proof that this was, in fact, a cynical political move? But Buehmiller continues collecting evidence that Bush is more queer-friendly than we may have thought. Quote, "Mr. Bush has appointed some openly gay federal officials to jobs at the White House," close quote. She then cites 2 gay men working on AIDS policy in the administration. But Buehmiller avoids mentioning Bush's appointment of Jerry Thacker to the Presidential Advisory Commission on HIV and AIDS. Thacker's nomination caused controversy because he had called AIDS the gay plague and had dubbed homosexuality a death style. Though he eventually withdrew himself from contention, neglecting to mention Thacker in such a piece is simply bad journalism.
On March 1st, Washington Post media critic Howard Kurtz found new evidence to prove a very old theory: liberal media bias. Kurtz looked at media coverage of San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom, the man who opened the gay marriage floodgates, and found a coverage largely upbeat. Kurtz contrasted that with press treatment of former Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore, who was booted from the bench after refusing to remove a monument to the 10 Commandments from the courthouse. Kurtz pointed to a New York Times article that noted the mayor's wide grin and his, quote, "business acumen, money, good looks, and friends in the right places," close quote, and his self-described pure and principled motives. And when the Times covered Moore, Kurtz says they were more critical, reporting that, quote, "civil liberties groups accused Justice Moore of turning a courthouse into a church," close quote, and that despite this, Moore had become, quote, "an Alabama folk hero," close quote. Kurtz's point is a little unclear. Is the Newsom portrayal biased? A smile, money, connections, and a high opinion of oneself sound like pretty reasonable observations here. Did the Times show both sides of the renegade conservative, but only the good side of the offending liberal? No. A full read of the Newsom article reveals that his detractors are quoted. If Kurtz's evidence is weak, his comparison is even weaker. As Slate.com pointed out, Newsom has defied a state law that he claims conflicts with the state constitution. The legality of his action has yet to be ruled on by any court. Moore, on the other hand, defied a federal court order and was removed from office by his peers after exhausting his appeals all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. When a reader pointed this out to Kurtz in an online forum, he had a strange response, writing, quote, "Presumably, the mayor will defy the courts if he loses the legal battle," close quote. But Kurtz doesn't need to presume anything. In the very same Times article he was writing about, Newsom promised to step down on the policy if the courts ruled against it. In the future, Kurtz might want to give a more thorough read to the articles he's criticizing.
And finally, with many American weapons floating around among the insurgents in Haiti, the March 8th issue of Time magazine decided to recap, quote, "some conflicts of the past few years that the U.S. has unwittingly armed," close quote. In a brief item headlined, "Those Guns Look Familiar," Time offers Afghanistan, Turkey, Colombia, and Nicaragua as examples of countries where the wrong people, quote, "got their hands on a stockpile of U.S. weapons," close quote. The idea is that in a given country, weapons were supplied to one group, the good guys, and somehow they ended up in the hands of another group, the bad guys. But Time neglects the fact that these supposedly different groups are often hard to distinguish from one another. For example, on Nicaragua, Time says, quote, American arms transferred to anti-Sandinista Contras in the 1980s are being used by active death squads across Central America, close quote. What Time doesn't mention is that the Contras were death squads, wittingly recruited, armed, and trained by the CIA, with millions of dollars of support from the Reagan administration. The international arms trade certainly deserves more media attention, but writing off U.S. support for unsavory characters as accidents isn't the way to do it.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. FAIR also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll be giving subscription information for Extra later on in the show.
For the past year, British newspapers have pursued allegations of U.S. and U.K. spying at the United Nations during the run-up to the Iraq War. What started with a leaked document from the National Security Agency turned into an examination of shadowy diplomatic maneuvering and a debate over the very legality of the war itself. While that all certainly sounds newsworthy, U.S. media outlets have, for the most part, kept their distance from this story. Joining us now is Martin Bright. He's the Home Affairs editor for the Observer newspaper in London. Martin Bright, welcome to Counterspin.
Glad to be here.
Now, first, let's go back to last March real quick. Remind our listeners what your paper was reporting back then.
Right, if you remember, at the time, it was just on the eve of war. There were still deliberations within the United Nations about getting a resolution to authorize the war from the United Nations so that this wouldn't simply be an Anglo-American Spanish operation. All the stops were being pulled out to try and get that resolution. At that point, we were past a top-secret email that came from the American National Security Agency to the government communication headquarters known as GCHQ in Britain, asking for their help in gaining intelligence about the various members of the Security Council whose votes were needed for a resolution authorizing war. And to us, this appeared to be an extraordinary story. And the leaking of the memo clearly showed that at least one person was extremely unhappy with this operation.
Now, the person who was eventually charged with leaking that and violating the Official Secrets Act was Katharine Gun. She was a translator at that government office, and her case was dropped not too long ago, and that got some attention in the U.S. media, which must have been confusing for readers who didn't know what the case was about in the first place. What do you think was potentially at stake in the Katharine Gun trial if the government had gone on with it?
I think we pretty much know that. We know that had the trial of this young woman, she was a 29-year-old translator of Chinese at the GCHQ, and we know that lawyers acting for her would have demanded documents from the British government about the legal basis on which they went to war. The argument was that Katharine Gun herself argued that she tried to stop the war, that by leaking this memo she hoped to raise the issue with the members of the Security Council that were being spied on. She hoped that would stop them voting for a resolution for war, and that the British government, without a resolution, would not go to war. She was hoping to see the legal advice, or her legal team was hoping to see the legal advice from the British government, demonstrating whether the British government thought they would go to war without a second United Nations resolution. And increasingly, it looks like the advice was, until the very last minute, that such action would be unlawful. If that had come out in the trial, it would have been devastating for the government, and they're trying very hard here to stop the information coming out now.
Now, the spying operation seems like it could have had an impact on the actual diplomatic efforts. Your paper was reporting that there was some talk about a compromise resolution, or at least there were some delegations meeting that were apparently the ones that were being spied on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we knew in March 2003 that the Chilean delegation at the United Nations, they had asked for reassurances from the American government about what was going on, and it appeared that they'd drawn a line under the matter. What then happened was the Chilean ambassador to the United Nations and his friend, the Mexican ambassador to the United Nations, earlier this year demonstrated that they had really not been happy at all about the spying operation, especially as they had been attempting at the very last minute to forge a compromise resolution that would have given at least a delay to action in Iraq. So paradoxically, and some might say tragically, an operation which was designed on the face of it to gain a legal basis for the war, in fact ended up scuppering a second resolution, because when the American authorities found out what the Mexicans and the Chileans were cooking up, US officials phoned the Mexican ambassador and said, well, when we said a second resolution, we didn't mean that kind of second resolution, and the whole thing was stopped.
Mm-hmm. Now, there have been some new spying allegations that have kind of kept this story alive. Claire Short, who resigned her cabinet post to protest Tony Blair's decision to go to war, recently claimed that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was also a target of this spying operation. That seems like big news. What effect did her story have in Britain?
Well, I mean, it had the effect of moving the story on, keeping the issue alive. Some might say that Claire Short, who resigned after the war, was a little less courageous than this young translator, and that perhaps she should have come forward on the eve of war and risked all as this young woman did. But what it meant was that the story didn't die with the end of the Catherine Gunn trial, and carried on embarrassing the government. Now, we ran a story this Sunday just gone saying that we now have a very good source telling us that there was a specific section of GCHQ in Britain set up precisely to spy on the United Nations. So this story is moving all the time.
Now, the U.S. press has done very little with any of this information. In response to the Observer's scoop last year, there was a Washington Post story that was headlined, "Spying Report No Shock to UN." The LA Times did a very similar story. Then after Claire Short came forward, a New York Times headline referred to spying at the UN as an old practice. What do you make of this dismissal that there's really no story here because there's always espionage at the United Nations?
Well, yes, I mean, it's all very well being cynical, isn't it? But it's really amused me to watch as this story has developed, pundit after pundit, in a sort of machismo way, saying, oh, well, we always knew this happened. Well, if actually you didn't know it always happened, it's only when whistleblowers come forward and tell you what happens that you find out what happens. And it really has saddened me to see the paltry efforts that have been made by the American press to investigate this. Clearly, if there was an operation specifically targeted at the so-called swing nations needed for a vote on the eve of war to, as the memo said at the time, to give the US an edge, then this is not just routine spying, the routine listening in on UN delegations. This is a targeted operation to get a specific result. And one of our biggest disappointments was when we first broke this story. We have limited resources in British newspapers. We were really hoping that our American colleagues would run with this, pick it up, use their bigger resources to look into it, but instead they just rather cynically said, oh, I mean, these things happen. Let's not bother actually being journalists and investigating what's going on. Let's just allow things to carry on as they always do. I mean, what's extraordinary to me is that it's precisely the job of a journalist never to say, oh, well, these things happen. It strikes me that it is constantly the job of a journalist to tell people what they should be shocked by.
Now, finally, Martin Bright, there was another excuse that came out of this from some of the media. An editor at the New York Times explained that they didn't follow up on the Observer's reporting because they prefer to do their own reporting on intelligence. And we heard a very similar explanation, in fact, the same explanation from someone at one of the network news outlets. Do you buy that idea?
Well, they haven't done in this case. I mean, I haven't seen a single piece of reporting. I haven't had a single conversation with American journalists that has led to any further information coming out from the American side. I had an extremely interesting conversation with the then UN correspondent of the New York Times, but she passed her information on to the so-called investigations unit of the New York Times, who did precisely nothing with it. There is so much more to come out that we can't always rely on brave whistleblowers from Britain to hand on these top-secret American documents. There needs to be a little bit of work done on your side of the Atlantic.
We've been speaking with Martin Bright. He's the Home Affairs editor at the Observer newspaper in London. You can read the paper's reporting online at www.observer.co.uk. Martin Bright, thanks so much for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thanks for inviting me.
When our next guest, veteran journalist Barry Lando, noticed a pattern of inaccuracy on the part of New York Times columnist William Safire, he tried to do something about it, but he got very little cooperation from the paper. In a February 21st article in Salon.com titled William Safire, Minister of Disinformation, Lando questions why a paper that issues corrections when a reporter gets a middle initial wrong allows its conservative columnist to publish glaring errors that can shape world affairs. Barry Lando, a former producer with CBS's 60 Minutes, joins us now from overseas in Paris. Welcome to Counterspin, Barry Lando.
Hi there.
Barry, I want to get to your experience with the New York Times in a minute, but let's begin with Safire. Describe, if you will, some of the inaccuracies you were trying to bring to the Times' attention.
Well, the particular inaccuracy that I was trying to bring to the Times' attention dealt with Safire's attacks against France, but which I'll get to. But in general, it seemed to me that he was becoming, if you will, kind of a mouthpiece for leaks coming out of the White House or out of the top levels of the administration, and trumpeting their charges through his column, whether it be charges about al-Qaeda's supposed links with Saddam Hussein, or in the case that I got interested in, the charge that France was selling rocket fuel or rocket components to Saddam Hussein with the knowledge of the French government, that a French broker was doing that and that French companies were doing that. And, of course, this followed up on the line that the French now were disloyal. They were no longer allies of the United States, and it was something I wanted to look into.
You found information that showed Safire's allegations to be wrong. Tell us a little bit about that.
It wasn't that difficult. I went to the broker in Paris that he charged with having been a conduit for rocket fuel components getting to Iraq from China. It was a very complex story. And the broker really didn't deny having attempted to do what Safire charged. But what in fact happened was that the trade was never consummated because of the French government. The French authorities stepped in and stopped it cold. And this was something that Safire obviously didn't know and hadn't really tried to find out. But it put a totally new slant on the story. In other words, instead of going along with what was happening, the French government were doing their best to stop it.
Well, there was another story, too, that you wrote about. That is a story that came from Doug Feith, working at the Pentagon, to the Weekly Standard, and then picked up by Safire. And this was about the alleged Prague connection.
Right. Well, that was the leak of a memo that Feith had apparently prepared for a U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee. The memo really contained raw intelligence data, and it was Safire and Weekly Standard also glommed on to certain parts of it that purported, again, to show links between Saddam and al-Qaeda. But in fact, as I say, it was raw intelligence, and strangely enough, the memo came out of the Pentagon originally, and it was the Pentagon that came out and said that any charges that there had been links between al-Qaeda and Iraq are, quote-unquote, inaccurate. This is coming from Rumsfeld's Pentagon. Further, they said they deplored the leak as being illegal. So the story didn't hold water once again, and yet Safire had glommed onto it in an attempt to bolster the line of certain hardline elements in the administration.
Well, now you've established that there was indeed a pattern of inaccuracies on Safire's part. Tell us about how you tried to bring all this to the attention of the New York Times.
Well, what I was concentrating on at the time was, because before actually the Standard article had come out, was Safire's attacks against France. And because it wasn't just one column, it went on through 3 columns. At the time, it had a tremendous impact because I was following it also on the Internet, and Safire's charges were being picked up and then being attributed not even to Safire any longer as they went around the world on the Internet, but now to the New York Times, as revealed by the New York Times. So anyways, I wrote an op-ed piece to the Times, giving them chapter on verse on what was wrong with Safire's allegations, how they didn't hold water. And within a couple of hours, I got an answer back from the Times saying, gee, very sorry, but we don't run op-ed pieces that take issue with our columnists. So then they suggested write a letter to the editor. Well, no one reads the letters to the editors, and instead, within 2 hours or 3 hours of my having sent them that op-ed piece, out comes another column from Sapphire continuing exactly the same charges, building on them, and this time accusing President Chirac and the French government of being part of this whole thing. I found it difficult to believe that the Times, having been put on notice that the original charges of Sapphire were full of hot air, that they would continue and allow him to continue. But they did, and the next day both those columns were picked up by the International Herald Tribune, which has tremendous impact around the world, simply because the Tribune is owned by the New York Times, and the editors of the Tribune, who had also let know that Sapphire's charges were incorrect, they had no choice. They had to run those columns.
More recently, in February, William Sapphire falsely touted a captured document as once again proving the al-Qaeda-Baghdad connection. Barry Lando, Sapphire has a reputation as a columnist who does a lot of reporting in his columns. What do you think this says? What is the lesson to be learned here from Sapphire's errors and from your experience with the Times?
Well, the Times, the last time around when I went back to them with another op-ed piece recently, they stated flatly that their policy does not compel their columnists to correct their mistakes. So in other words, the charges are out there no matter what. And whether they come from Sapphire or they come from other columnists as well, such as Krugman and Maureen Dowd have been caught out as well. In other words, it's not just from the right, but it doesn't make any difference. They are under no obligation to correct their errors. And if it were the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, maybe it wouldn't make that much difference. But when it's the New York Times, the world's paper of record, and these allegations are attributed to the New York Times, I think the Times has a special responsibility to act.
We've been speaking with former 60 Minutes producer Barry Lando. You can read his article, William Sapphire, Minister of Disinformation, at Salon.com. Thanks again for joining us, Barry Lando.
You're welcome.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR, based in New York. FAIR also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following toll-free number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. Be sure to tell them that you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. You can also listen to Counterspin at FAIR's website at www.fair.org. This show was engineered by Alex Noyes at Mercer Media and co-hosted by Peter Hart and myself, Steve Rendell. Thanks for listening to Counterspin. Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, a British and American plan to spy on United Nations delegations in New York has been big news in Britain, opening up a debate over the diplomatic struggles leading up to the war with Iraq and the legality of the war itself. The U.S. media, though, has hardly batted an eye at the story. We'll talk to one of the lead reporters on this story, Martin Bright of the London-based Observer newspaper, about what they've been reporting and why he thinks the story has failed to attract attention here in America. Also on Counterspin today, when a veteran journalist challenged New York Times columnist William Sapphire on matters of accuracy, he found the newspaper wouldn't print his column and had no workable policy for correcting misinformation on its op-ed page. Former CBS 60 Minutes producer Barry Landau will tell us about his experience trying to keep the New York Times honest. All that's coming up, but first we'll take a look back at the week's press.
When Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide was whisked out of Haiti by a U.S. government plane on February 29th, the White House insisted that Aristide resigned and fled Haiti voluntarily. The next day, though, stories emerged contradicting this official line. Human rights activist Randall Robinson and Congresswoman Maxine Waters each reported that Aristide told them he'd been the victim of a coup and was taken away from Haiti under duress when U.S. authorities told him they would not protect him and his family if he stayed. Whatever the truth, with such controversy swirling around this story, ABC's Nightline oddly chose to make Assistant Secretary of State Roger Noriega its lone guest on March 1st. Noriega, of course, dismissed contradictory accounts, but that wasn't the only strange thing about the Nightline episode. Since Noriega was the only guest on a controversial subject, Nightline had a responsibility to inform its viewers about his background. Viewers should have been clued into the fact that Noriega had been trying to undermine Aristide since his days working for the Organization of American States in the early 90s. In 1994, Noriega opposed returning the democratically elected Aristide to office after his removal by a military coup. And in 1997, Noriega went to work for the far-right U.S. Senator Jesse Helms, a man said to have shared Noriega's loathing of Aristide. Nightline anchor Chris Bury might have also questioned Noriega's commitment to democracy by citing Noriega's support for the coup d'etat against Venezuela's elected president Hugo Chavez in April 2002. Bury might also have questioned Noriega about official U.S. support to Haitian opposition groups and about reports that Haiti's armed opposition have been seen carrying state-of-the-art U.S. weapons. Instead, all Nightline offered viewers was the official story, one that had been available to them throughout the preceding day.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan caused a stir on February 25th when he apparently announced that Social Security was in financial trouble. One nightly newscast said that Greenspan warned that a financial catastrophe is looming, while another said that critics predict nothing short of a train wreck ahead. That's always been the media consensus. The real debate is when the train wreck will actually happen. According to CBS correspondent John Robert, that train wreck will happen just 4 years from now. As he explained on February 25th, quote, Alan Greenspan was looking ahead 4 years to the date the nation's 77 million baby boomers start to retire. That's when the Social Security surplus, which has been used to offset government spending, begins to dwindle and, in 2017, disappears altogether, close quote. But the Social Security surplus does not disappear in 2017. That is when estimates suggest the fund will start paying out more money in benefits than it collects in taxes. It will actually still have a multi-trillion-dollar surplus at that time. A more relevant but less alarming report might note that according to the Social Security Trustees report, the fund is projected to pay all promised benefits through the year 2042 with no changes whatsoever. And for the record, Greenspan actually sounded less alarmist than the media reports. He expressed more concern for Medicare than for Social Security, cautioning that, quote, the concern is not so much about Social Security, where benefits are tied in a mechanical fashion to retirees' wage histories, and we have some useful tools for forecasting future outlays, close quote. That's not quite the story you heard in the press, but they've been writing the collapse of Social Security story for so many years, it's hard to get them to stop.
On March 1st, New York Times correspondent Elizabeth Buehmiller devoted her White House letter feature to George W. Bush's support for a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. Buehmiller says that Bush's critics are wrong if they think that this move is proof that he's either intolerant or playing politics. She writes, quote, although the president's behavior might reinforce the view among his critics that he was acting cynically when he endorsed the amendment, the fact is that he has a record of tolerance in personal situations, close quote. Buehmiller then described Bush's warm relations with an old friend who is gay. But it doesn't matter what Bush thinks of gays or lesbians in private. And if Bush is, in fact, comfortable with gays and lesbians, does his decision to back the amendment conflict with his personal views? Couldn't that actually be considered proof that this was, in fact, a cynical political move? But Buehmiller continues collecting evidence that Bush is more queer-friendly than we may have thought. Quote, Mr. Bush has appointed some openly gay federal officials to jobs at the White House, close quote. She then cites 2 gay men working on AIDS policy in the administration. But Buehmiller avoids mentioning Bush's appointment of Jerry Thacker to the Presidential Advisory Commission on HIV and AIDS. Thacker's nomination caused controversy because he had called AIDS the gay plague and had dubbed homosexuality a death style. Though he eventually withdrew himself from contention, neglecting to mention Thacker in such a piece is simply bad journalism.
On March 1st, Washington Post media critic Howard Kurtz found new evidence to prove a very old theory: liberal media bias. Kurtz looked at media coverage of San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom, the man who opened the gay marriage floodgates, and found the coverage largely upbeat. Kurtz contrasted that with press treatment of former Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore, who was booted from the bench after refusing to remove a monument to the Ten Commandments from the courthouse. Kurtz pointed to a New York Times article that noted the mayor's wide grin and his, quote, business acumen, money, good looks, and friends in the right places, close quote, and his self-described pure and principled motives. And when the Times covered Moore, Kurtz says they were more critical, reporting that, quote, civil liberties groups accused Justice Moore of turning a courthouse into a church, close quote, and that despite this, Moore had become, quote, an Alabama folk hero, close quote. Kurtz's point is a little unclear. Is the Newsom portrayal biased? A smile, money, connections, and a high opinion of oneself sound like pretty reasonable observations here. Did the Times show both sides of the renegade conservative, but only the good side of the offending liberal? No. A full read of the Newsom article reveals that his detractors are quoted. If Kurtz's evidence is weak, his comparison is even weaker. As Slate.com pointed out, Newsom has defied a state law that he claims conflicts with the state constitution. The legality of his action has yet to be ruled on by any court. Moore, on the other hand, defied a federal court order and was removed from office by his peers after exhausting his appeals all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. When a reader pointed this out to Kurtz in an online forum, he had a strange response, writing, quote, presumably, the mayor will defy the courts if he loses the legal battle, close quote. But Kurtz doesn't need to presume anything. In the very same Times article he was writing about, Newsom promised to step down on the policy if the courts ruled against it. In the future, Kurtz might want to give a more thorough read to the articles he's criticizing.
And finally, with many American weapons floating around among the insurgents in Haiti, the March 8th issue of Time magazine decided to recap, quote, some conflicts of the past few years that the U.S. has unwittingly armed, close quote. In a brief item headlined, Those Guns Look Familiar, Time offers Afghanistan, Turkey, Colombia, and Nicaragua as examples of countries where the wrong people, quote, got their hands on a stockpile of U.S. weapons, close quote. The idea is that in a given country, weapons were supplied to one group, the good guys, and somehow they ended up in the hands of another group, the bad guys. The Time neglects the fact that these supposedly different groups are often hard to distinguish from one another. For example, on Nicaragua, Time says, quote, American arms transferred to anti-Sandinista Contras in the 1980s are being used by active death squads across Central America, close quote. What Time doesn't mention is that the Contras were death squads, wittingly recruited, armed, and trained by the CIA with millions of dollars of support from the Reagan administration. The international arms trade certainly deserves more media attention, but writing off U.S. support for unsavory characters as accidents isn't the way to do it.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. FAIR also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll be giving subscription information for Extra later on in the show.
For the past year, British newspapers have pursued allegations of U.S. and U.K. spying at the United Nations during the run-up to the Iraq War. What started with a leaked document from the National Security Agency turned into an examination of shadowy diplomatic maneuvering and a debate over the very legality of the war itself. While that all certainly sounds newsworthy, U.S. media outlets have for the most part kept their distance from this story. Joining us now is Martin Bright. He's the Home Affairs editor for the Observer newspaper in London. Martin Bright, welcome to Counterspin.
Glad to be here.
Now, first, let's go back to last March real quick. Remind our listeners what your paper was reporting back then.
Right, if you remember, at the time, it was just on the eve of war. There were still deliberations within the United Nations about getting a resolution to authorize the war from the United Nations, so that this wouldn't simply be an Anglo-American Spanish operation. All the stops were being pulled out to try and get that resolution. At that point, we were past a top-secret email that came from the American National Security Agency to the government communication headquarters, known as GCHQ, in Britain, asking for their help in gaining intelligence about the various members of the Security Council whose votes were needed for a resolution authorizing war. And to us, this appeared to be an extraordinary story. And the leaking of the memo clearly showed that at least one person was extremely unhappy with this operation.
And the person who was eventually charged with leaking that and violating the Official Secrets Act was Katharine Gun. She was a translator at that government office, and her case was dropped not too long ago, and that got some attention in the U.S. media, which must have been confusing for readers who didn't know what the case was about in the first place. What do you think was potentially at stake in the Katharine Gun trial if the government had gone on with it?
Yeah, I think we pretty much know that. We know that had the trial of this young woman, she was a 29-year-old translator of Chinese at the GCHQ, and we know that lawyers acting for her would have demanded documents from the British government about the legal basis on which they went to war. The argument was that Katharine Gun herself argued that she tried to stop the war, that by leaking this memo she hoped to raise the issue with the members of the Security Council that were being spied on. She hoped that would stop them voting for a resolution for war, and that the British government, without a resolution, would not go to war. She was hoping to see the legal advice, or her legal team was hoping to see the legal advice from the British government, demonstrating whether the British government thought they would go to war without a second United Nations resolution. And increasingly, it looks like the advice was, until the very last minute, that such action would be unlawful. If that had come out in the trial, it would have been devastating for the government, and they're trying very hard here to stop the information coming out now.
Now, the spying